Unfaithful, 2002, full movie breakdown. Overview. Unfaithful is a 2002 American erotic thriller and drama directed by Adrian Lyne, a filmmaker already famous for exploring the dangerous territory of desire, betrayal, and marriage in films like Fatal Attraction and Indecent Proposal. With Unfaithful, Lyne once again turns his camera toward the quiet suburbs of upper-class America and asks a question that has haunted storytellers for centuries. What happens when a single moment of temptation is allowed to grow into something that can no longer be controlled? The film stars Richard Gere and Diane Lane as Edward and Connie Sumner, a seemingly content married couple living a comfortable life in Westchester County, New York, along with their young son. Their world is disrupted when Connie has a chance encounter in the city with a charming French book dealer named Paul Martel, played by Olivier Martinez, and what begins as an innocent accident spirals into a passionate affair that ultimately shatters the fragile peace of their household. Unfaithful is not based on an entirely original screenplay. It draws its core premise from the 1969 French film La Femme Infidèle, directed by Claude Chabrol, though Lyne and his writers, Alvin Sargent and William Broyles Jr., reshape the story for an American setting and give it a very different emotional and moral texture. The film was produced by Regency Enterprises and distributed by 20th Century Fox, and it was released theatrically in the United States on May 8, 2002. It became both a commercial success and a serious awards contender, largely on the strength of Diane Lane's performance, which many critics considered one of the finest of her career. The film explores marriage, guilt, jealousy, and the psychological unraveling that follows infidelity, wrapped in Lyne's signature visual style of sensuality mixed with tension and dread. Plot details. The story begins by introducing the Sumner family as the picture of suburban stability. Edward Sumner runs a successful security company, and his wife Connie manages their household and cares for their 11-year-old son, Charlie. Their marriage appears steady, if a little routine, the kind of long-term partnership that has settled into comfortable predictability rather than passionate excitement. On a windy afternoon in Manhattan, while running errands, Connie is literally blown off her feet by a gust of wind and collides with a young stranger. That stranger is Paul Martel, a handsome French rare book dealer who lives nearby. He insists on tending to her scraped knee, inviting her up to his apartment to clean the wound, and their conversation is charged with an unspoken flirtation neither of them acknowledges outright. Connie leaves that first meeting unsettled, aware that something has been stirred within her that she cannot easily name. What follows is not a single dramatic leap into betrayal but a slow, deliberate seduction built through small choices. Connie finds reasons to return to the city, to walk past Paul's building, to accept his invitations for coffee. Each visit pulls her further from the safety of her marriage and closer to a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed, someone daring, desired, and alive with a kind of hunger that domestic routine had quietly suppressed. Eventually the flirtation turns physical, and Connie begins a full affair with Paul, meeting him secretly in his apartment, while telling her husband and her friends elaborate lies to cover her absences. Lyne stages these early encounters with a mixture of eroticism and unease, using quick editing and fragmented memory shots to show how thoroughly the affair begins to occupy Connie's mind even when she is physically present with her family. As the affair deepens, cracks begin to show. Connie becomes distracted and inconsistent, her explanations grow thin, and small physical details, a lost earring, an unfamiliar snow globe, a receipt, begin to accumulate as evidence that something is wrong. Edward, who has always trusted his wife completely, starts to notice these inconsistencies and grows suspicious. Rather than confronting her directly, he hires a private investigator to follow her, driven by a mixture of disbelief and dread. When the investigator's photographs confirm his worst fears, showing Connie entering Paul's apartment building and remaining there for hours, Edward is devastated. The film spends significant time inside Edward's grief, portraying a husband trying to process the collapse of the identity he had built around being a devoted family man and a trusted partner. The turning point of the film arrives when Edward, unable to contain his anguish, drives into the city and confronts Paul directly at his apartment. What begins as a tense but controlled conversation escalates quickly. Paul, unaware of exactly who Edward is at first, behaves with a casual arrogance that inflames Edward's rage, and in a sudden, almost accidental burst of violence, Edward strikes Paul with a snow globe that Connie had given him as a gift, killing him. The murder is not depicted as a calculated act of vengeance but as an explosion of raw emotion, a moment where years of suppressed hurt and humiliation erupt uncontrollably. Panicked, Edward wraps Paul's body in a rug and disposes of it, attempting to erase all evidence of what happened. From this point forward, the film transforms from a story about infidelity into a tense psychological thriller about guilt, complicity, and the unraveling of a family built on secrets. Connie, unaware that Edward has killed Paul, is confused and hurt when her lover fails to answer her calls or show up to their planned meetings. She eventually learns of his death through a news report, and is consumed by shock and grief that she cannot openly express, since admitting her devastation would reveal the affair to her husband and to the police investigating the murder. Edward, meanwhile, is forced to maintain the appearance of a grieving, betrayed husband while carrying the unbearable weight of having committed a murder, all while detectives slowly close in on the case. As the investigation into Paul's death intensifies, both Edward and Connie are drawn into a shared conspiracy of silence, each protecting the other for different reasons, out of love, guilt, fear, and a desperate need to preserve what remains of their family. The film builds tension through interrogations, near discoveries, and quiet, loaded exchanges between husband and wife who now understand each other's darkest secrets without ever fully discussing them aloud. The story reaches its climax as Edward, racked with guilt, considers turning himself in to the police, understanding that continuing to live inside the lie may be more destructive than facing the consequences of his actions. The film deliberately ends on an ambiguous note, showing the Sumners driving toward a police station, the outcome of their decision left unresolved, forcing the audience to sit with the moral weight of everything that has unfolded rather than offering a clean resolution. Cast and characters. Richard Gere plays Edward Sumner, the betrayed husband whose journey from unquestioning trust to devastating violence forms the emotional backbone of the film. Gere, already an established leading man known for roles in films like Pretty Woman and American Gigolo, brings a controlled, simmering intensity to Edward, portraying a man whose civilized exterior hides a capacity for destruction he never knew he possessed. Diane Lane plays Connie Sumner, the film's central figure, whose descent into an affair and subsequent guilt anchors the story. Lane's performance was widely praised for its emotional honesty, capturing both the intoxicating thrill of Connie's awakening desire and the crushing weight of guilt that follows. Her work in Unfaithful earned her a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Actress, a milestone that marked a significant career resurgence and cemented her reputation as one of the most compelling dramatic actresses of her generation. Olivier Martinez plays Paul Martel, the charismatic French book dealer whose brief but consuming relationship with Connie sets the tragedy in motion. Martinez brings a magnetic, effortless charm to the role that makes Connie's attraction to him believable without reducing him to a simple villain or seducer, allowing the character to feel like a genuine emotional alternative to the routine of Connie's marriage rather than merely a temptation. Eric Persullivan plays Charlie Sumner, the couple's young son, whose innocence and need for stability quietly raise the stakes of every decision his parents make throughout the film. The supporting cast includes Chad Lowe, Kate Burton, and Dominic Chianese in smaller but meaningful roles that flesh out the world surrounding the Sumner family, including friends, colleagues, and the investigators who slowly close in on the truth. Direction, production, and release. Adrian Lyne's direction is central to what makes Unfaithful distinct from a typical thriller. Lyne has built much of his career around stories of desire and consequence, and here he uses fragmented editing, lingering close-ups, and a moody visual palette to place the audience directly inside Connie's psychological experience, blurring the line between memory, guilt, and desire. The screenplay, adapted by Alvin Sargent and William Broyles Jr. from the source material of Claude Chabrol's La Femme Infidèle, reworks the original French film's more detached, observational tone into something more immediate and emotionally raw, suited to Lyne's interest in intimate psychological drama. The film was produced by Regency Enterprises in association with 20th Century Fox, with Arnon Milchan among the producers. It was shot primarily in and around New York, using the wealthy Westchester suburbs as a visual contrast to the crowded, anonymous intimacy of Manhattan, reinforcing the divide between Connie's domestic life and her secret one. Unfaithful was released theatrically in the United States on May 8, 2002, and went on to gross well over $100 million worldwide against a modest budget, making it a solid commercial success. Critical reception at the time was largely positive, with many reviewers highlighting Diane Lane's performance as the emotional centerpiece of the film, alongside praise for Lyne's tense, atmospheric direction. The promotional trailer for Unfaithful leaned heavily into its central mystery and moral tension, teasing the affair, the suspicion, and the shocking act of violence without revealing the full outcome, drawing audiences in with the promise of a story about desire that carries devastating consequences. Over time, the film has remained a frequently referenced example of the modern erotic thriller, studied both for its craftsmanship and for the way it handles the emotional aftermath of betrayal with unusual depth and seriousness rather than treating infidelity as simple shock value. Unfaithful, the complete story. The ordinary life of the Sumners. There are marriages that announce their trouble loudly, with slammed doors and raised voices echoing through the house, and there are marriages that carry their trouble quietly, folded so deep beneath routine that even the people living inside them cannot see it. The marriage of Edward and Connie Sumner belonged to the second kind. From the outside, and even from the inside on most ordinary mornings, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. A handsome house set among the trees of Westchester County. A husband who ran a successful security company and left for the train each morning in a pressed shirt. A wife who managed the rhythms of the household with the quiet competence of someone who had built an entire identity around being needed. A son, Charlie, 11 years old, whose laughter filled the kind of home that magazines like to photograph. Nothing was wrong. That was the strange, dangerous truth of it. Nothing was wrong, and yet something had gone still. Connie Sumner had not set out to become the woman she was at 30-something, standing in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and cut flowers, folding laundry with the automatic precision of a woman who had done it 10,000 times before. She had simply arrived there, the way people arrive at the middle of their lives, one ordinary day compounding into another until an entire decade had quietly assembled itself behind her. She loved her husband. She loved her son fiercely, the way mothers do, with a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. And if there was a small, persistent hum beneath all of it, a sense that some part of her had gone unused, unclaimed, unseen, she had learned not to listen to it too closely. Most people learn to live with that hum. Most people never have a reason to stop and ask what it means. Edward, for his part, was a man who had built his life on the premise of control. His company protected other people's assets, other people's homes, other people's sense of safety, and he ran it with the same steady hand he brought to everything. He was not a passionate man in the theatrical sense, but he was devoted, reliable in the way that some people mistake for dullness and others recognize as the rarest kind of love. He trusted his wife completely, not because he had never considered the alternative, but because the alternative had simply never occurred to him as something that needed considering. Trust, for Edward, was not a decision he made every day. It was the ground he stood on, so solid beneath his feet that he had long since stopped noticing it was there at all. There were mornings, before any of it began, when Connie would stand at the kitchen window watching Edward back the car down the driveway, and something in her chest would tighten pleasantly at the sight of him, a small private affection that belonged only to her. She was not a woman who felt trapped by her life. She had chosen it, every part of it, from the house to the town to the man she had married, and for a long time the choosing had felt like enough. It was only in the quietest hours, after Charlie had gone to bed and Edward had fallen asleep in front of the television with the particular exhaustion of a man who worked hard and slept well because his conscience never troubled him, that Connie would sometimes sit alone in the dark kitchen and feel the shape of a question she could not quite bring herself to ask. Was this all there was? Not because anything was missing, exactly, but because nothing new had arrived in so long that she had almost forgotten what newness felt like. Edward, for his part, carried his own quiet satisfactions and his own quiet blind spots. He believed, with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never been given reason to doubt it, that a marriage functioned the way his business functioned, through consistency, through the steady accumulation of small, dependable acts that built trust over time. He showed up. He provided. He came home. In his mind, these were not small things, they were the entire architecture of love, and he could not have imagined that Connie might be hungry for something his steadiness could never quite supply. He was, in his own way, a romantic, though he would never have used the word to describe himself. He simply believed that the romance of a long marriage looked different from the romance of a new one, quieter, less urgent, but no less real. He was not wrong about that. He was only wrong to assume that Connie had fully made peace with the difference. It was into this quiet, settled world, built on two people's separate, and only partially compatible understandings of what their marriage was supposed to be, that the wind arrived. The morning the wind changed everything. New York City in early autumn has a particular kind of wind, a wind that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, funneling down the corridors between buildings and catching pedestrians off guard at the exact moment they least expect it. Connie had come into the city on an ordinary errand, one of 100 small tasks that filled her days, and she was walking against that wind when it did what New York wind sometimes does. It lifted her off her feet, quite literally, and sent her stumbling into a young man crossing the street in the opposite direction. Her knee scraped against the pavement. Her bag scattered. And when she looked up, apologizing, flustered, embarrassed in the particular way that strangers are embarrassed by sudden physical contact, she found herself looking into the face of Paul Martel. He was, by any reasonable measure, an extremely handsome man, but it was not only his looks that stopped her breath for a half-second longer than the moment required. It was the ease of him. The unhurried, almost amused way he crouched down to help gather her things, the faint trace of a French accent that made ordinary words sound like they had been chosen with unusual care. He insisted, with the kind of gentle stubbornness that leaves no real room for refusal, that she come up to his apartment nearby to clean the scrape on her knee. Connie protested, out of habit more than conviction, and then found herself following him anyway. His apartment surprised her. It was not the apartment of a careless young man but of someone who had built a life around beautiful, old things. Rare books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and softened by decades of handling, the air faintly scented with paper and dust and something else, something warm and unfamiliar that she could not immediately place. There was a stillness to the space that felt at odds with the chaotic city outside, as if Paul had constructed a small, private world where time moved differently, where the urgency of the street below simply did not apply. He moved through this world with an unhurried confidence that Connie found herself watching more closely than she meant to, the way he selected a cloth, ran warm water, knelt in front of her without any apparent self-consciousness about the intimacy of the gesture. He tended to her knee with an attentiveness that felt almost old-fashioned, asking her questions about herself that had nothing to do with the practical matter of the injury, questions about what she did with her days, what she loved, what she had wanted for herself before she became whoever it was she had become. Nobody had asked Connie those particular questions in years. Not because the people around her did not care, but because the questions had simply stopped seeming necessary once the answers appeared to have already been settled. Wife, mother, homemaker. The categories were comfortable and true, and Connie realized with a small jolt of surprise, entirely insufficient to describe everything she still privately felt herself to be. The entire encounter lasted no more than 20 minutes, and yet Connie left that apartment carrying something she had not walked in with. A question. A small, unfamiliar flutter that she recognized, with something close to alarm, as the feeling of being noticed. Truly noticed, the way she had not been noticed in a very long time, not because Edward had stopped seeing her but because the seeing had become so familiar it had lost its charge. The way a favorite song eventually stops registering as music and simply becomes background. Paul had looked at her the way a stranger looks at something for the first time, with genuine curiosity, and that unfamiliar attention landed on Connie like sunlight after a long winter, warm in a way that made her acutely aware of how cold she had not realized she was. She told herself, walking back toward the train that evening, that it meant nothing. A pleasant encounter with a stranger, the kind of small story she might tell at a dinner party. She did not tell Edward about it. There was no reason to. It was nothing. And yet that night, lying beside her husband in the dark, she found her mind returning to the apartment full of old books, to the careful way Paul had wrapped her knee, to the sound of his voice saying her name for the first time. Nothing, she told herself again. And some quiet, honest part of her did not believe it. The return. It is one of the oldest patterns in human weakness, the way a person convinces themselves that returning to temptation is different from seeking it out. Connie did not decide to see Paul Martel again. She simply found, over the following days, that her errands kept drawing her toward his neighborhood. She told herself she needed to properly thank him for his kindness. She told herself it would be rude not to. Each justification was small and reasonable on its own, and each one carried her one step closer to a door she had not yet admitted she wanted to walk through. When she did see him again, it was almost accidental, and almost inevitable. Coffee turned into conversation that lasted far longer than either of them intended. Paul had a way of listening that made Connie feel, for the first time in longer than she could name, like a woman rather than a role. Not a wife. Not a mother. Not the manager of a household. Simply a woman, sitting across from a man who found her interesting, who laughed at the things she said, who looked at her the way people look at something they want. The line between friendship and something more was not crossed all at once. It eroded, the way a riverbank erodes, so gradually that no single moment could be blamed for the collapse. There were more meetings. More coffee that became lunch, more lunch that became long afternoons spent in his apartment surrounded by his books, talking about nothing and everything, the conversation itself a kind of intimacy that Connie had almost forgotten was possible. And then, on an afternoon that felt no different from the others until it was entirely different, the conversation stopped, and something else began. What followed was an affair conducted in the secret architecture that all affairs are built on: careful timing, invented errands, a phone that needed to be checked in private, a story ready in case anyone asked where she had been. Connie became, without entirely meaning to, fluent in a language of small lies. She told herself, as people in her position always do, that it changed nothing at home. That she loved Edward exactly as much as she always had. That this other thing, this secret thing, existed in a separate compartment of her life that would never touch the rest. It is a comforting lie, and it is always, eventually, a false one. In Paul's company, Connie found a version of herself she had stopped visiting. Reckless. Desired. Alive in a way that had nothing to do with schedules or responsibilities. There was an afternoon, early in the affair, when they rode a carousel together in a nearly empty park, Connie laughing in a way that felt almost foreign to her own ears, loud and unguarded and entirely without the careful modulation she brought to laughter at home, where every sound she made existed within the context of being a wife and a mother, of setting an example, of maintaining a particular version of herself for an audience that never stopped watching, even when that audience loved her. With Paul, there was no audience. There was only the strange, dizzying freedom of being unwatched, unaccountable, entirely her own. The affair became, for a time, the brightest thing in her life, and that brightness made the rest of her life feel dimmer by comparison, which only pulled her back toward him more strongly. She found herself, on ordinary evenings at home, replaying conversations from Paul's apartment, while Edward described his day at dinner, catching herself and feeling a hot flush of guilt, quickly suppressed, quickly buried beneath a practiced smile and a nodded response to whatever Edward had just said. Charlie, oblivious in the particular way that children are oblivious to the adult currents running beneath their household, continued to chatter about school and friends and small dramas that mattered enormously to him, and Connie loved him no less for the secret she was carrying, though she sometimes wondered, in her more honest moments, whether that secret had already begun to change the mother she was, however invisibly. It was not a story about a woman who stopped loving her husband. It was a story about a woman who had forgotten, somewhere in the long middle stretch of an ordinary life, that she was allowed to feel anything at all beyond contentment, beyond gratitude, beyond the quiet satisfaction of a life well managed. Contentment, she was discovering, was not the same thing as being fully alive, and once she had tasted the difference, she found she could not simply forget it, could not simply return to the comfortable numbness she had mistaken for happiness before the wind blew her into a stranger on a city street. The affair did not feel, to Connie, like a betrayal in the moment she was living it. It felt like a resurrection. It was only later, in the quiet after, that the word betrayal would arrive and refuse to leave. The cracks begin to show. Guilt, when it is buried rather than confronted, does not disappear. It finds other ways to surface. Connie began to notice small changes in herself that she could not fully control. A restlessness in ordinary conversations with Edward. A distraction that made her miss half of what her son said to her at dinner. She grew careful in ways that, ironically, made her seem more suspicious rather than less, checking her phone with a quickness that had not existed before, offering explanations for her whereabouts before anyone had thought to ask for one. Edward noticed these changes the way a person notices a change in the weather before they can name what has shifted. Nothing specific. Nothing he could point to and say, "This is wrong." Just a low, persistent unease, a sense that the woman he had shared a bed with for over a decade had become, in small and difficult-to-define ways, someone slightly different from the woman he thought he knew. He was not a suspicious man by nature. He did not go looking for evidence of betrayal because betrayal had never been part of the world he understood himself to live in. But the unease did not go away. It sat with him during his commute. It followed him into meetings. It waited for him at the dinner table, in the space of a half-second too long before Connie answered a simple question about her day. The physical evidence, when it began to appear, arrived in the mundane, almost absurd way that evidence of an affair always does. A snow globe, small and unfamiliar, tucked among Connie's things, that she claimed to have bought for Charlie, and then somehow forgot to give him. An earring that did not match its pair, found somewhere it had no reason to be. A perfume Edward did not recognize on a jacket that should not have carried any scent at all. Individually, each detail was nothing. A man determined to trust his wife could explain any single one of them away. But they did not arrive individually. They arrived in a slow accumulation, each one adding weight to a suspicion that Edward did not want to feel and could no longer fully deny. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to a person beginning to suspect their spouse of betrayal, a loneliness made worse by the fact that it cannot yet be spoken aloud. Edward found himself replaying small moments from years of marriage, searching them retroactively for signs he might have missed, wondering whether the woman he had built his life around had always possessed a capacity for secrecy he simply had never been given reason to notice. He watched Connie across the dinner table and felt, for the first time in their marriage, that he did not entirely know what he was looking at. It was a disorienting, almost vertiginous feeling, like discovering a locked room in a house he had lived in for over a decade, a room whose existence he had never once suspected. He could not confront Connie with a snow globe and an unfamiliar perfume. He had no proof, only a feeling, and feelings, he told himself, were not enough to accuse the person he trusted most in the world, not enough to risk the accusation itself becoming a wound that could never fully heal even if he turned out to be wrong. There were nights he lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing, and rehearsed conversations he never had the courage to start in the morning light, when the ordinary business of the day made the previous night's suspicions feel foolish, exaggerated, unworthy of a man who considered himself rational and fair. And then some new small detail would surface. A phone call ended too quickly when he walked into the room, an afternoon she could not quite account for, and the suspicion would return, sharper than before, refusing this time to be reasoned away. So he did what a careful, controlled man does when he cannot bear the uncertainty any longer. He decided to find out the truth for himself, telling himself, even as he searched for the number of a private investigator, that he was doing it to put his own mind at rest, that the search would surely turn up nothing, that he would look back on this period of doubt as an aberration, a brief and slightly embarrassing lapse in the trust that had defined his entire marriage. He did not yet let himself consider the alternative. Some part of him, the part that had built an entire company around anticipating danger before it arrived, already knew better. The investigator's proof. Hiring a private investigator to follow his own wife was, for Edward, one of the most difficult and humiliating decisions he had ever made. It felt like a betrayal in its own right, a quiet admission that the trust he had built his entire life around was no longer something he could take for granted. He told himself it was simply due diligence, the same instinct that made him good at his job, applied now to the one area of his life he had never thought to question. But some part of him understood, even as he made the call, that he was not looking for reassurance. He was looking for confirmation of something he already, on some level, knew. The investigator's reports arrived over the following days with the clinical detachment of a man doing his job. Times. Locations. A building in Manhattan that Connie visited with increasing frequency, staying for hours at a time, always alone when she arrived and always alone when she left. And then, finally, the photographs. Grainy, distant, taken through a long lens from across a street, but unmistakable all the same. Connie entering a building. Connie, at a window, laughing at something a man Edward did not recognize had said. Connie in an embrace that left no room for alternate explanation. Edward sat with those photographs for a long time before he could bring himself to do anything at all. He sat in his car in a parking lot for the better part of an hour, the envelope resting on the passenger seat as though it might do something dangerous if he touched it again too quickly, and he found himself, absurdly, noticing small details of the world around him with unnatural clarity, the particular gray of the sky, the sound of a car alarm somewhere in the distance, the way his own hands looked unfamiliar resting on the steering wheel. This is what shock does. It sharpens the irrelevant while the essential fact refuses, for a while, to fully land. There is no adequate way to describe the particular devastation of seeing, in stark black and white, the exact shape of a betrayal you had spent weeks trying not to believe was real. It was not simply anger, though anger was certainly part of it, arriving in waves that left him gripping the wheel until his knuckles ached. It was grief, the specific grief of losing something that had not technically died but had nonetheless ceased to exist in the form he had believed it to hold. He grieved the marriage he thought he had the way a person grieves a death, because in a sense it was a death, the death of an understanding he had built his entire adult life around. The woman he thought he knew, the life he thought he was living, the quiet certainty that had let him sleep soundly every night for over a decade, all of it dissolved in the space of a few photographs, replaced by a version of reality he had no idea how to inhabit. In the days that followed, Edward performed the ordinary rituals of his life with the strange, hollow competence of a man operating on autopilot. He went to work. He answered emails. He sat across from Connie at dinner and asked Charlie about his day, and no one in his household seemed to notice that the man occupying Edward's chair had, in some essential way, already left the family that surrounded him, carrying his devastation privately, turning the photographs over and over in his mind long after he had physically put them away in a drawer he made sure Connie would never open. And yet, in the days that followed, Edward did not confront Connie. He could not. Some combination of pride, disbelief, and a desperate, irrational hope that there might still be an explanation kept him silent, watching his wife move through their home with a devastating new clarity, seeing now the small tells he had missed before, the distraction, the distance, the careful performance of normalcy that had, in retrospect, never quite been normal at all. He carried the photographs with him, a private, unbearable weight, waiting for a moment he did not yet know how to create. The confrontation. The decision to go to Paul Martel's apartment was not, in the end, a calculated one. Edward would later be unable to fully explain, even to himself, exactly what he intended when he got into his car that evening and drove into the city. Perhaps he told himself he only wanted to see the man's face, to understand what it was that had drawn his wife away from him. Perhaps he told himself he simply needed to talk, one man to another, to make sense of a situation that made no sense at all. Whatever the intention, it did not survive contact with the reality of the encounter. Paul answered the door without knowing who Edward was, and in that gap of recognition, in the casual, unbothered way Paul carried himself even after Edward identified himself as Connie's husband, something in Edward broke loose. It was not the calm, controlled arrogance of a man aware of the gravity of the situation. It was the careless confidence of someone who had never had to consider consequences, who treated the affair, and by extension Connie herself, with a lightness that Edward found unbearable. Paul's manner, whether intentional or simply careless, read to Edward as a kind of mockery, as though the destruction of Edward's marriage and the devastation of his trust amounted to nothing more than an inconvenient interruption in Paul's evening. There was a moment, brief and now unrecoverable, when the encounter might have gone differently. A moment when Paul, sensing perhaps the depth of the other man's pain, might have softened, might have offered something resembling remorse, and Edward, given even a small gesture of genuine contrition, might have turned and walked back out the door with nothing more than his broken heart intact. That moment passed. Whether because Paul genuinely failed to grasp the gravity of what he had done, or because pride would not allow him to appear diminished in front of the husband of the woman he had been seeing, he responded to Edward's anguish with a dismissiveness that read, in that charged room, as contempt. And contempt was the one thing Edward's carefully controlled nature could not absorb. The conversation escalated quickly, moving from tense words to something more physical, voices rising, the argument no longer about explanations or apologies but about something older and more primal. Two men in a small room, each convinced the other had taken something irreplaceable from him. And in the chaos of the moment, in a burst of rage that Edward had never known himself capable of, had never once in his entire adult life suspected himself capable of, he reached for the nearest object within reach. It was, with a cruelty that only hindsight could fully register, the snow globe Connie had given him, the same object that had first raised his suspicions months earlier, small and heavy and entirely unremarkable, the kind of object that exists in 1,000 homes without ever being asked to bear the weight of what it was about to do. A single, violent strike. Paul fell. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, broken only by the sound of Edward's own ragged breathing, he understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to change anything, that he had killed a man. He stood over Paul's body for what felt like a very long time, unable to move, unable to fully process the transformation that had just occurred, the way a single irreversible second had converted him from a betrayed husband into something else entirely, something he had no framework for understanding himself to be. Every instinct in him screamed to call for help, to undo what could not be undone, and every instinct in him simultaneously understood, with a cold clarity that frightened him, that no ambulance, no confession made in that moment, could bring Paul back or restore Edward's own life to anything resembling what it had been that morning. What followed was not the calculated precision of a criminal, but the desperate improvisation of an ordinary man trying to survive an extraordinary catastrophe. Edward's hands shook as he worked, his mind splitting itself into two separate currents, one carrying out the grim mechanics of concealment, while the other stood apart in horror, watching him do it, as though some part of him refused to fully accept ownership of the actions his body continued to perform. He wrapped Paul's body with movements that felt borrowed from someone else entirely, some colder, more capable version of himself he had never known existed, and every sound in the building, every distant creak or footstep in the hallway outside, sent a fresh jolt of terror through him, certain each time that discovery was only seconds away. The drive that followed was, in its own way, as harrowing as the act itself, Edward navigating unfamiliar roads in the dark with the singular, all-consuming focus of a man who understood that a single mistake, a single moment of carelessness, would end not only his own life as he knew it but Connie's and Charlie's as well. He found the words forming in his mind unbidden, fragments of prayers he had not spoken since childhood, bargains offered to a God he was not certain he still believed in, promises to be a better man, a better father, if only this one night could somehow be undone. It could not. And by the time he pulled back into his own driveway in the gray hour before dawn, letting himself quietly into a house where his wife and son slept undisturbed, Edward Sumner understood that he had crossed into a version of his life from which there was no possibility of full return. What happened next unfolded with the strange, mechanical calm that sometimes follows catastrophic events, a kind of numbed functionality that allows the mind to perform necessary tasks even while it refuses to fully process what has occurred. Edward did not call the police. He did not call anyone. Instead, driven by an instinct for self-preservation that overrode every other consideration, he wrapped Paul's body in a rug from the apartment and carried it out to his car under cover of darkness, disposing of it in a location far from the city, erasing, as best he could, every trace of what had happened in that apartment. He drove home that night a fundamentally different man than the one who had left that morning, carrying a secret that would now define every remaining moment of his life. The silence that followed. Connie's discovery of Paul's death did not come from Edward. It came, with a cruel irony, from a news report, a brief mention of an unidentified man found dead, later identified through investigation as Paul Martel, a rare book dealer with no immediate suspects in his death. The grief that hit Connie in that moment was total and, worse, entirely unspeakable. She could not call anyone to share it. She could not cry openly, could not explain to her friends why she seemed suddenly hollow, could not even fully allow herself to feel the depth of the loss without simultaneously confronting the reality that mourning Paul meant admitting, at least to herself, exactly how much he had come to mean to her. She grieved in silence, in stolen moments, in a kind of private devastation that had nowhere to go. And all the while, she had no idea that the man responsible for her lover's death was sleeping beside her every night, carrying his own unbearable silence, watching her grief and interpreting it correctly as confirmation of everything he had already suspected, while she remained entirely unaware that her husband was not simply a betrayed man but a murderer. The strange, terrible intimacy that developed between Edward and Connie in the weeks that followed was unlike anything either of them could have anticipated. They did not speak of the affair directly. They did not speak of Paul's death directly. And yet an understanding passed between them in glances, in silences, in the careful way they began to move around each other, each one sensing that the other was carrying something enormous without either having the words, or the courage, to name it aloud. Edward began to suspect, correctly, that Connie's grief for Paul ran far deeper than a passing affair would explain. Connie began to suspect, though she could not have said exactly why, that Edward knew more than he was letting on. Their marriage, which had once been built on unspoken trust, was now held together by an entirely different kind of unspoken understanding, a shared complicity born not of love but of mutual survival. Each protected the other, not out of forgiveness, not yet, but out of a tangled combination of fear, guilt, and the desperate hope that their family, damaged as it now was, might still be salvageable if the truth never fully surfaced. There were nights when Connie would catch Edward watching her across a room with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between tenderness and dread, and she would feel a flicker of something she did not want to examine too closely, a suspicion so unthinkable that her mind refused to fully form it into words. She told herself it was simply the strain of the affair's discovery, the natural distance that follows any betrayal, and she did not allow herself to wonder why Edward, upon learning of her infidelity, had never once raised his voice, had never demanded the details she expected any wounded husband to demand, had instead retreated into a silence that felt less like heartbreak and more like something being carefully, deliberately managed. Edward, meanwhile, found himself in the strange position of comforting a grief he could not acknowledge understanding the true cause of. He would find Connie standing motionless in a doorway, her eyes distant, and some old instinct of tenderness, not yet extinguished despite everything, would prompt him to reach for her, to ask if she was all right, and he would watch her flinch back into composure, offering some small, unconvincing lie about being tired, and he would nod and let the moment pass, carrying his knowledge of its real cause like a stone in his chest. There was a particular cruelty in this arrangement that neither of them spoke aloud, the fact that they were now each other's only possible confidants for the two greatest secrets of their lives, and yet the very nature of those secrets made genuine confiding impossible. They were, in this sense, more alone within their marriage than they had ever been, even as they moved through their days with a new, careful gentleness toward one another that an outside observer might almost have mistaken for tenderness restored. The net closes. As the police investigation into Paul Martel's death continued, the pressure on the Sumner household intensified in ways that neither Edward nor Connie could fully control. Detectives began asking questions, first of Paul's neighbors and associates, and eventually, as the investigation widened, of people connected to him in less obvious ways. Edward, whose professional expertise in security had once been a source of pride, now found himself acutely, painfully aware of every mistake he might have made, every trace of evidence he might have failed to erase, every possible thread that could unravel the fragile cover he had built around that single, catastrophic night. Connie, for her part, existed in a state of constant, quiet terror, aware that her own connection to Paul, if discovered, would immediately place her at the center of the investigation, and aware, too, though she could not fully articulate the feeling, that something about Edward's behavior in the weeks since Paul's death did not add up. He was different. Quieter. Watchful in a way he had never been before. She began, without consciously deciding to observe her own husband with the same careful attention she had once reserved for planning her secret meetings with Paul, and what she observed unsettled her in ways she could not yet name. The investigation crept closer with each passing week, detectives following threads that led, inevitably, back toward the Sumner household, toward questions about Connie's relationship with the victim, toward the kind of scrutiny that threatened to expose not only the affair but the murder that had grown out of its discovery. There were visits from investigators that arrived without warning, ordinary afternoon knocks on the door that sent both Edward and Connie's hearts racing before they had even opened it, each of them separately rehearsing, in the seconds it took to cross the hallway, the calm, unremarkable faces they would need to wear for however long the visit lasted. Detectives asked questions that sounded innocuous on the surface, about Paul's circle of acquaintances, about anyone who might have visited his apartment, about whether Connie, whose name had apparently surfaced somewhere in Paul's own records or the recollections of a neighbor, had known the deceased at all. Connie's answers during these encounters were masterpieces of careful omission, technically true in their particulars while concealing the essential fact that would have unraveled everything. Yes, she had met Paul Martel. A brief, forgettable encounter, an assist after a fall on a windy street, nothing more. She delivered these half-truths with a composure that frightened her afterward, alone, replaying the conversation and marveling, with a kind of sick fascination, at how easily deception had come to occupy a woman who had once considered herself fundamentally honest. Edward, for his part, was asked fewer direct questions, his connection to the victim entirely unknown to investigators who had no reason yet to suspect that Connie's husband had ever set foot inside Paul Martel's apartment. But every question directed at Connie in his presence tightened something in his chest, a private terror that any wrong word, any small inconsistency, might be the thread that pulled the entire fabric of their fragile secrecy apart. The tension inside the house became almost unbearable, a slow, suffocating pressure that neither Edward nor Connie could escape, each moving through their days performing a version of normal family life while privately calculating how much longer the truth could remain buried. Ordinary domestic moments, breakfast, homework, the small logistics of a shared life, took on an eerie, theatrical quality, as though the Sumners were now merely playing the roles of a happy family for an audience of one another, each aware that the other was performing, either willing to be the first to break character and admit how far beneath the surface the real story had sunk. It was during this period that the full weight of what Edward had done began to settle over him in a way it had not during the initial chaos of the act itself. He was not, by nature or history, a violent man, and the reality of having taken a human life, whatever the circumstances, sat on him with a crushing, inescapable heaviness. He began to understand that the secret he carried was not something he could simply outlast. It would not fade with time. It would not soften into something bearable. It would remain permanently the defining fact of his existence, poisoning every relationship, every quiet moment, every future he might have imagined for himself and his family. The weight of what remains. In the final stretch of the story, Edward is left to confront a question that has no comfortable answer: whether to continue living inside a lie that grows heavier with every passing day, or to face the devastating consequences of the truth, for himself, for Connie, and most painfully, for their son, who remains entirely innocent of everything that has unfolded around him. He turns the question over during long stretches of sleeplessness, weighing the practical realities of confession, the almost certain end of his freedom, the destruction of the company he built, the shame that would attach itself permanently to Charlie's name in the small, gossiping world of their community, against the alternative. A lifetime spent carrying a secret so heavy it had already begun reshaping the man he understood himself to be. There is no version of the future, he comes to realize, in which he simply returns to who he was before that night in Paul's apartment. Even if the secret remains buried forever, even if no detective ever traces the threads back to him, he understands that something essential in him has already been altered, permanently, by the act of taking a life, however unplanned, however provoked. He watches himself, in quiet moments, flinch at sounds he would never have noticed before, watches himself calculate risk and exposure with the same grim vigilance he once reserved only for his professional work, and understands that this vigilance has now become the permanent architecture of his inner life, whether or not the outside world ever learns the truth. The film resists offering a clean, satisfying resolution to this dilemma, choosing instead to sit with its characters in the unbearable weight of the choice itself. It does not moralize. It does not punish or reward its characters according to any tidy formula of guilt and consequence. Instead, it simply observes, with unflinching patience, what it looks like when two people who once believed themselves to be good, decent, ordinary people are forced to reckon with the reality that they are now capable of the very things they would once have found unthinkable in others. Connie, too, is forced to reckon with the full shape of what her affair set in motion. Whatever she believed about the boundaries of her secret life, whatever comforting lies she told herself about it existing in a separate compartment from her marriage and her family, those boundaries have been utterly destroyed. A man is dead. Her husband is a murderer. Her son's entire future now hangs on decisions being made in rooms he knows nothing about. The affair that once felt like a private awakening, a reclaiming of some lost part of herself, has metastasized into something that threatens to consume everything she once considered safe and permanent. Throughout this final stretch of the story, Charlie remains a quiet, constant presence at the edges of every scene, a reminder of what is actually at stake beneath the abstractions of guilt and justice that occupy his parents. He asks ordinary questions at ordinary moments, wanting help with homework, wanting to know when they can go to the movies together as a family, entirely unaware that the answers to those small requests are being calculated by two people privately negotiating the collapse and possible survival of everything he has ever known as home. It is Charlie, more than any detective or any piece of evidence, who represents the true cost of every choice that has led the Sumners to this point, and it is the thought of Charlie, more than fear of consequence, that seems to weigh most heavily on both Edward and Connie as they consider what to do next. There is a scene, late in the story, where Edward and Connie sit together in their car outside their own house, either willing to go back inside until they have said something true to each other, perhaps for the first time since this entire ordeal began. What passes between them in that conversation is not forgiveness, not exactly, and not absolution, which either of them is in any position to offer the other. It is something closer to recognition, two deeply flawed people finally seeing each other clearly, without the protective performances of the perfect marriage they had spent so many years maintaining. Connie admits, in her own way, to the hunger that drove her toward Paul, the sense of having disappeared inside her own life. Edward admits, in his own way, to the violence that hunger ultimately provoked in him, a violence he still does not fully recognize as belonging to the man he believed himself to be. In the film's closing movement, Edward and Connie, having finally spoken openly to each other about everything that has happened, the affair, the murder, the months of unbearable silence, find themselves driving together toward a police station, Edward apparently prepared to confess to what he has done. The scene is deliberately restrained, free of dramatic speeches or tearful declarations, instead capturing two people sitting with the quiet, terrible gravity of an irreversible decision, the radio off, the road ahead lit only by their own headlights, neither of them speaking because there is, at this point, nothing left that words can adequately carry. The film ends before they arrive, the car simply moving forward through the night, leaving the audience to sit with the same uncertainty the characters themselves are facing, unresolved, unfinished, the question of what happens next handed entirely to the imagination of whoever is watching. This ambiguous ending is, in many ways, the entire point of the story. Unfaithful is not interested in delivering easy justice or a tidy moral lesson. It is interested in the slow, devastating chain of consequences that can follow from a single, seemingly small choice, the way one afternoon of temptation can, through an unbroken sequence of very human decisions, lead to devastation no one involved could have imagined at the start. Every step along the way, from the accidental collision on a windy street to the final, silent drive toward the police station, is made up of choices that felt, in their individual moments, small enough to be reversible. A cup of coffee. A second visit. A silence kept instead of a truth told. It is only in retrospect, looking back over the entire arc of the story, that the true weight of those small choices becomes visible, each one a link in a chain that no single person involved ever intended to forge. It asks its audience to consider not simply who is guilty and who is innocent, but how ordinary people, capable of love and loyalty and genuine devotion, can also be capable of choices that destroy everything they claim to value most. Connie never stopped loving her son. Edward never stopped believing himself to be a fundamentally decent man. And yet love and decency, the film insists, are not inoculations against catastrophe. They exist alongside human weakness, human hunger, human rage, not in some separate, protected compartment but tangled together in the same imperfect person, capable at any moment of either great tenderness or great destruction depending on which pressures happen to align. In refusing to resolve that question neatly, the film leaves its audience carrying the same weight its characters carry, long after the credits have rolled, unable to say with any certainty what they themselves would have done differently at any single juncture along the way, and unable, too, to fully condemn either Edward or Connie without recognizing some small, uncomfortable piece of their own capacity for the same failures. That discomfort, more than any twist or any moment of violence, is what has allowed Unfaithful to remain a story people continue to discuss and revisit years after its release, a mirror held up to the quiet vulnerabilities that exist inside even the most stable-looking marriages, waiting, sometimes, for nothing more than a strong gust of wind on an ordinary afternoon to set everything in motion. Unfaithful, the lives behind the cast. Richard Gere. Richard Gere was born in 1949 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the son of an insurance agent father and a homemaker mother, in a household that valued discipline and modesty far more than the glamour that would eventually come to define his public life. He grew up in the small town of Syracuse, New York, a setting that could not have felt further removed from the world of film stardom he would later inhabit, surrounded by the ordinary rhythms of a working, middle-class upbringing rather than any early exposure to the entertainment industry. As a young man he showed an early aptitude for music, learning to play several instruments including guitar and trumpet, and this musical foundation would later surface unexpectedly in some of his film roles, where his genuine instrumental ability allowed directors to feature him performing on screen rather than relying on the illusion typically used for actors playing musicians. He carried this musical talent into higher education, winning a music scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he also began exploring philosophy and gymnastics alongside his formal studies, a period of broad intellectual and physical exploration that would later inform the disciplined, deliberate approach he brought to his acting career. College, however, did not hold him for long. Gere left before completing his degree, drawn instead toward the world of theater, and he began building a career on the stage in regional productions before eventually making his way to New York City, where the raw energy of live performance offered him a training ground far more demanding than any classroom could have provided, forcing him to develop both technical skill and emotional resilience under the unforgiving immediacy of live audiences. His early professional years were defined by persistence rather than immediate success. He took roles in off-Broadway productions, understudied for larger productions, and slowly built a reputation among casting directors as a young actor with an unusual intensity, someone capable of holding a stage with a kind of quiet, coiled magnetism rather than obvious showmanship. During these years he lived the itinerant, financially uncertain life common to young performers in New York, taking odd jobs between auditions and roles and slowly developing the discipline that would come to define his approach to acting throughout his career. His breakthrough on the London stage in a production that required him to perform with striking physical vulnerability helped establish him as a performer willing to take creative risks, drawing attention not only for the boldness of the performance itself but for the seriousness and precision with which he approached a role that many actors of his generation might have shied away from. And it was this same willingness that eventually carried him into film. His early screen work in the 1970s placed him in smaller roles before he landed the part that would begin to define his career, a young hustler navigating the underworld of Los Angeles nightlife in a film that shocked and captivated audiences in equal measure. The role established Gere as an actor unafraid of moral ambiguity, someone capable of making audiences sympathize with characters whose choices they might otherwise condemn, and it introduced audiences to a quality that would recur throughout his career, a stillness that suggested far more was happening beneath the surface than the character was willing to reveal. Directors quickly recognized that Gere possessed a rare ability to communicate volumes through restraint, a signature that distinguished him from performers who relied more heavily on visible emotional display. It was in the 1980s that Gere transformed from a respected character actor into a genuine leading man and a defining face of a particular kind of American masculinity, controlled, elegant, quietly wounded beneath a polished exterior. A string of significant films built his reputation as one of the era's most reliable romantic leads, pairing him with some of the most respected directors and actresses of the period, and by the end of the decade he had become one of the most recognizable actors in the world, his name alone sufficient to draw audiences into theaters regardless of the specifics of a given project. He cultivated, across this period, a screen persona built around controlled sensuality, an actor who understood that restraint could be more seductive than overt display, a lesson that would prove essential decades later to his work as Edward Sumner. The role that cemented his status as a true cultural icon arrived in the early 1990s, when he starred opposite Julia Roberts in a modern romantic fable about class, transformation, and unexpected connection. The film became a global phenomenon, one of the defining box office successes of its decade, and Gere's performance, warm, restrained, and quietly generous toward his co-star, helped define an entire era of romantic cinema, introducing him to a new generation of audiences and cementing his reputation across international markets far beyond the United States. It also, somewhat paradoxically, threatened to typecast him as a symbol of wealthy charm precisely when he was most interested in exploring darker, more psychologically complex material, a tension between public image and creative ambition that would shape much of his subsequent career. Throughout the following decade, Gere worked deliberately to diversify his output, taking on roles that explored corruption, moral compromise, and the hidden fractures beneath outwardly successful lives, appearing in courtroom dramas, political thrillers, and character studies that allowed him to move away from the romantic leading man image the previous decade had cemented. He built a reputation for choosing projects based on the strength of the material and the ambition of the director rather than simply chasing box office certainty, frequently favoring collaborations with filmmakers whose vision he respected over more commercially predictable projects, and this pattern of careful, considered choices led him directly to Unfaithful in 2002. By the time he took on the role of Edward Sumner, Gere was in his early 50s, an actor with decades of experience playing men whose composed exteriors concealed turbulent interior lives, and Edward represented, in many ways, the fullest and darkest expression of that recurring interest. Critics and audiences alike responded to the way Gere allowed Edward's devastation to build almost silently across the film, resisting the temptation toward melodrama and instead conveying an entire arc of grief, suspicion, and eventual violence through small, restrained physical choices, a tightened jaw, a held breath, a stillness that felt more frightening than any outburst could have been. Reviewers of the period frequently singled out the film's confrontation scene as a demonstration of exactly the kind of controlled intensity Gere had spent decades refining, noting that the violence, when it finally arrived, felt shocking precisely because of how completely it broke with the character's established composure. It was widely regarded, at the time and in the years since, as one of the more mature and psychologically layered performances of his career, a role that asked him to be simultaneously sympathetic and genuinely frightening, and one that many critics felt deserved more formal awards recognition than it ultimately received. Beyond his acting career, Gere became known throughout his life for a deep and sustained commitment to humanitarian causes, particularly his advocacy connected to Tibetan Buddhism, a faith he adopted after years of personal exploration following early encounters with Buddhist teachers and philosophy that he has described as fundamentally reshaping his understanding of his own life and priorities. This spiritual commitment visibly shaped his public persona in the decades following his rise to stardom, and he became one of the most prominent voices in the Western world advocating for Tibetan autonomy and human rights, a position that occasionally created friction with major film markets and industry relationships. A tension he accepted as the cost of a set of convictions he refused to compromise for professional convenience, even when that meant limiting his own opportunities within certain international markets. He also devoted significant time and resources to causes surrounding HIV and AIDS awareness, poverty relief, and homelessness support, building a public identity that extended well beyond the characters he played on screen, engaging in on-the-ground advocacy work rather than simply lending his name to causes from a distance. In his personal life, Gere experienced the kind of highly publicized relationships and marriages that come with decades spent in the public eye, navigating both the successes and the difficulties of maintaining a private life under intense and sustained media scrutiny. He became, later in life, a father who spoke openly about the profound way parenthood reshaped his priorities and his understanding of his own legacy, describing fatherhood in interviews as one of the most grounding and clarifying experiences of his life, arriving as it did after decades already spent building both a career and a set of deeply held personal convictions. Across a career spanning more than 5 decades, Richard Gere remained a performer defined by restraint, an actor who understood that the most powerful emotions are often the ones held just beneath the surface, a quality that made him uniquely suited to the quiet devastation at the heart of Edward Sumner, a character whose entire tragedy stems from the gap between what he outwardly presents and what he privately carries. Diane Lane. Diane Lane was born in 1965 in New York City, the daughter of an acting coach father and a mother who worked, at different points, as a nightclub singer and a Playboy centerfold, an unconventional upbringing that placed young Diane in close proximity to the world of performance almost from birth. Her parents separated when she was very young, and she was raised primarily by her father, who recognized her natural talent early and began guiding her toward the stage rather than a conventional childhood, immersing her in acting technique and performance discipline at an age when most children were still being introduced to the alphabet. By the age of 6, she was already performing in experimental theater productions in New York, working alongside adult performers in avant-garde productions that demanded a level of concentration and emotional access far beyond what would typically be asked of a child that age, developing a level of discipline and professional seriousness that few children her age were ever asked to carry. This early, intense immersion in performance would come to define both the extraordinary trajectory of her career and the complicated relationship she would later describe having with the loss of an ordinary childhood, a tension between professional achievement and personal cost that she has revisited with considerable candor throughout later interviews across her adult life. Lane's breakthrough arrived remarkably early, when she was cast in a major film role at the age of 13, a performance that immediately marked her as an unusually gifted young talent capable of carrying real emotional weight far beyond her years. The role brought her instant fame, and by her mid-teens she had already appeared on the cover of major magazines and been discussed in the press using the kind of language typically reserved for far more experienced performers, with some critics of the era going so far as to describe her as the most promising young actress of her generation. This early fame came with significant pressure, and Lane has spoken candidly across her career about the difficulty of growing up under such intense public scrutiny, of trying to navigate adolescence while simultaneously being regarded as a fully formed screen actress, expected to deliver performances of adult sophistication while still working out the ordinary confusions of being a teenager. Her teenage and early adult years included a mixture of striking successes and quieter periods, as she worked to find roles substantial enough to match the promise of her earliest performances, all while managing the particular challenge that child stars often face of proving, again and again, that their talent was not simply a product of youthful novelty. There were stretches during this period when major offers slowed considerably, a common pattern for performers who achieve extraordinary early fame only to find the industry uncertain of how to cast them as they mature, and Lane has described this period candidly in later interviews as a time of genuine professional uncertainty, one that required her to rebuild momentum in her career from a position far less secure than her explosive debut might have suggested it would be. The 1990s saw Lane continue building a body of work marked by versatility, moving between dramas, romances, and ensemble pieces, steadily earning a reputation among directors and fellow actors as a performer of unusual emotional intelligence, someone capable of conveying enormous internal complexity through subtle, controlled choices rather than obvious displays of technique. She worked consistently throughout the decade, taking on supporting and leading roles across a range of genres, building the kind of steady professional foundation that would ultimately support the more demanding dramatic work still ahead of her, even as broader public recognition of her talent had not yet caught back up to the level it had reached during her celebrated teenage debut. It was not until the early 2000s that Lyne experienced what many critics and industry observers described as a full-scale career renaissance, a period in which she delivered a series of performances that finally matched the towering promise she had shown as a teenager decades earlier. Unfaithful, released in 2002, became the definitive centerpiece of this renaissance. Lyne's portrayal of Connie Sumner required her to navigate an extraordinarily difficult emotional range within a single performance, capturing the intoxicating thrill of a woman rediscovering her own desirability, the mounting guilt of ongoing betrayal, and finally the devastating, largely silent grief of losing a lover she could never publicly mourn. She approached the role with a level of physical and emotional openness that many critics noted required considerable courage, allowing the camera to linger on moments of genuine vulnerability rather than retreating into the more guarded, controlled performances that often define star vehicles of this kind. Critics were nearly unanimous in their praise, describing her work as raw, unguarded, and remarkably honest, and the performance earned her a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Actress, along with numerous other critical accolades that year, including recognition from several major critics' associations who cited her work as among the finest screen performances of the year in any category. The success of Unfaithful reintroduced Diane Lyne to audiences and industry decision-makers as a leading actress of significant dramatic power, opening the door to a string of prominent roles throughout the following decade across a range of genres, from romantic dramas to major franchise films. She followed the success of Unfaithful with further acclaimed dramatic work exploring similarly complicated relationships and difficult emotional territory, continuing to build a reputation as an actress unafraid of morally ambiguous material, before eventually expanding her range further into large-scale studio productions. She would go on to take on some of the most recognizable maternal figures in modern American blockbuster cinema, appearing in major superhero franchise films that introduced her to an entirely new generation of viewers who may have had little awareness of her decades of prior work, a career pivot that demonstrated her continued versatility even as she moved firmly into the more mature phase of her career. Throughout all of these later successes, Lyne has continued to be closely associated in critical conversation with her performance in Unfaithful, frequently cited as one of the defining dramatic performances of her career and a touchstone example of an actress fully inhabiting the psychological complexity of a morally compromised character without ever sacrificing the audience's empathy for her. Film scholars and critics revisiting the performance in the years since its release have often pointed to the physical specificity of her work, the way small, seemingly unremarkable gestures, a distracted glance, a hesitation before answering a simple question, carried enormous psychological weight, communicating the character's inner turmoil without ever resorting to more obvious or theatrical displays of distress. In interviews given across the years following the film's release, Lyne spoke about the demands of the role with characteristic thoughtfulness, describing the challenge of finding emotional truth in a character whose choices she did not necessarily endorse but whose humanity she was determined to protect fully on screen. She has often described her approach to the role as one rooted in empathy rather than judgment, insisting that Connie Sumner needed to be understood as a fully realized person rather than simply a cautionary figure. An approach that critics widely credited as the source of the performance's lasting power and its continued relevance as one of the most discussed portrayals of infidelity and its psychological aftermath in modern American film. Her personal life, like that of many performers who grew up in the public eye, included significant relationships and periods away from the spotlight, including marriages and a daughter whose upbringing Lyne has spoken about with the particular thoughtfulness of someone determined to offer her own child a childhood different from the unusually early professional immersion that had defined her own. Prioritizing stability and ordinary experience in a way that reflected the lessons she had drawn from her own unconventional upbringing. She has spoken in later interviews about wanting her daughter to have the freedom to choose a path in life without the pressures of inherited fame or the expectation of early professional achievement, a reflection of how deeply her own childhood experience shaped her instincts as a parent decades later. But her professional identity has remained remarkably consistent across the decades, that of a serious, disciplined actress whose earliest training in experimental theater as a small child continued to inform the precision and honesty of her work well into her 50s and beyond. A through line connecting the 6-year-old performing on New York stages to the accomplished dramatic actress who brought Connie Sumner to such devastating, believable life, a career built not on the fleeting novelty of early fame but on decades of sustained, deliberate craft. Olivier Martinez. Olivier Martinez was born in 1966 in Paris, France, and grew up immersed in a culture that placed enormous value on cinema as both art and national identity, an environment that shaped his early ambitions toward a career in front of the camera. He came of age watching a generation of French leading men who carried themselves with a particular kind of unhurried confidence, and he absorbed that sensibility early, developing an approach to performance that favored internal stillness over outward demonstration, a quality that would later distinguish him sharply from many of his American contemporaries. He began pursuing acting seriously as a young man, taking on early roles in French television before working his way into feature films, building his craft gradually within an industry that valued theatrical training and a slow accumulation of credibility over rapid, manufactured stardom. He began his acting career in French film and television during the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, building a substantial reputation within the French film industry as a leading man capable of blending classical romantic appeal with a more brooding, intense screen presence. His work during this period established him as one of the most sought-after young actors in French cinema, and he received significant critical recognition domestically, including nominations from France's most prestigious film awards for his dramatic performances. Work that showcased a range extending from period drama to contemporary romance, and established him as a serious dramatic actor rather than simply a matinee idol. Martinez's transition into English language and international film work began in earnest in the late 1990s, as directors outside of France increasingly took notice of his particular screen quality, a combination of old-world elegance and simmering physical intensity that felt distinct from the typical leading man archetype found in American cinema at the time. This transition required considerable adjustment, as Martinez worked to build fluency and comfort performing in English, a language he had not grown up speaking, and he approached this challenge with the same disciplined seriousness that had characterized his earlier theatrical and cinematic training in France, determined not to let the language barrier diminish the nuance and precision he brought to his performances. His casting as Paul Martel in Unfaithful represented a significant milestone in this international transition, placing him opposite two of American cinema's most established stars in a major studio production directed by a filmmaker known for his exacting standards and his history of eliciting strikingly intimate, emotionally exposed performances from his casts. The role required Martinez to embody a character whose charm needed to feel genuinely magnetic rather than simply predatory, a seducer whose appeal to Connie Sumner had to feel earned and believable rather than a convenient plot device, someone the audience could understand her being drawn to even while recognizing the devastation that attraction would ultimately unleash. Critics widely credited Martinez with achieving exactly that balance, bringing a warmth and specificity to Paul Martel that elevated the character beyond a simple catalyst for the film's tragedy, noting in particular his ability to suggest genuine tenderness alongside the character's obvious self-assurance. A combination that made Connie's attraction to him feel like a believable human response rather than a simple narrative convenience. The visibility that Unfaithful brought to Martinez's career opened further opportunities in American and international productions throughout the following years, and he continued to build a body of work that spanned both French-language cinema and English-language international productions, maintaining strong ties to the French film industry even as his profile grew internationally. He took on a range of roles across historical dramas and contemporary thrillers in the years following Unfaithful, continuing to work with both American and European directors, and his performances during this period consistently drew on the same qualities that had made Paul Martel such a memorable screen presence. An unforced charisma paired with an underlying seriousness that kept his characters from ever feeling shallow or purely decorative. Beyond his professional career, Martinez became a notable figure in entertainment press coverage due to a series of high-profile personal relationships with other well-known public figures, a level of media attention that, at various points, threatened to overshadow discussion of his actual body of screen work. A familiar tension for performers whose personal lives generate as much public interest as their professional output. Throughout his career, however, Martinez remained committed to a body of work defined by a distinctly European sensibility, favoring roles that allowed for emotional nuance and psychological complexity over more straightforward genre filmmaking, a preference that traced back to the foundations of his training and early career within the French film tradition, and one that continued to shape the choices he made even as opportunities in larger, more commercially driven American productions became increasingly available to him. Eric Pursullivan. Eric Pursullivan was born in 1991 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and began his acting career as a child, appearing in a number of film and television projects during the late 1990s before landing the role that would define the most visible portion of his early career, a younger brother in a long-running television comedy that became one of the most beloved family sitcoms of its era. His casting in that series came after a series of auditions during which he stood out precisely for the qualities that would define his performance style throughout his childhood career, an unforced, naturally funny delivery that never seemed to be reaching for a laugh, paired with a genuine, unguarded warmth that made him instantly endearing to audiences and to the adult performers who worked alongside him. His work on that series ran for several years and established him, while still quite young, as one of the more recognizable child performers of his generation, known for a distinctive comic delivery and an unusually natural, unforced screen presence that avoided the exaggerated mannerisms sometimes associated with child actors of that period. Balancing a demanding television production schedule with the ordinary requirements of childhood was not without its difficulties, and Sullivan, like many young performers working on long-running series, navigated on-set tutoring, unusual working hours, and a level of public recognition that few children are ever asked to manage. Despite these pressures, those who worked with him during this period frequently described him as remarkably grounded for a child in his position, a quality that industry observers often attributed to a stable family environment that prioritized his well-being alongside his career. Sullivan's casting as Charlie Sumner in Unfaithful, which came while he was still actively filming his regular television series, represented a notable departure from the comedic register that had defined his work up to that point, requiring him instead to serve as the quiet emotional center of a serious, adult psychological drama, a role built less around dialogue than around presence, the simple, devastating fact of a child's innocence existing alongside his parents' unraveling secrets. Though the role was relatively small in terms of screen time, it required a different kind of skill than his comedic television work, an ability to convey warmth and vulnerability without overplaying the material, trusting silence and small reactions to carry the emotional weight rather than the broader comic timing his television audience knew him for. Sullivan's performance was generally well received as an effective, understated counterpoint to the film's heavier adult drama, with several reviewers noting that his scenes provided the audience a necessary emotional anchor amid the moral complexity surrounding his parents. Following the eventual conclusion of the television series that made him famous and his supporting role in Unfaithful, Sullivan gradually stepped back from a highly visible acting career as he moved into adulthood, a choice not uncommon among performers who spent significant portions of their childhood in the public eye. He chose instead a quieter and more private path into adult life away from the intensity of the industry that had shaped his earliest years, pursuing interests outside of the entertainment world and largely avoiding the kind of continued public visibility that many of his fellow child performers sought to maintain. A decision that has allowed him a degree of normalcy that his years of early fame might otherwise have made difficult to reclaim. The supporting performers. Chad Lowe, who appears in the film in a supporting capacity, was born into a family already well established in the entertainment industry, and he began his own acting career while still a teenager, taking on roles in television and film throughout the 1980s that gradually built his reputation as a capable, emotionally sincere performer distinct from the more commercially glossy image sometimes associated with young actors of his generation. He became particularly well known for a role in a television drama exploring adolescence and family life that earned him significant critical recognition, including a major television award for his performance as a young man navigating serious illness within his family, a performance widely praised at the time for its honesty and its refusal to sentimentalize genuinely difficult material. Lowe continued to build a varied career across the following decades, working consistently in film and television, while also expanding into directing later in his career, a natural evolution for a performer who had spent decades observing the craft of storytelling from in front of the camera before choosing to step behind it as well. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, he took on a steady stream of supporting and character roles across film and television, developing a reputation among directors as a reliable, versatile performer capable of bringing depth to smaller parts within larger ensemble productions, exactly the kind of skill his role in Unfaithful called upon. His contribution to the film added another example to a body of work defined by an interest in emotionally grounded, character-driven material rather than larger commercial productions, consistent with the choices he had been making across his career up to that point. Kate Burton, who also appears in a supporting role, comes from one of the most respected families in American theater and film, the daughter of the legendary actor Richard Burton, a lineage that might easily have overshadowed a lesser performer but that Burton instead used as a foundation from which to build a substantial and entirely independent career of her own. She trained seriously in theater from a young age, attending drama school and working her way through regional and New York stage productions before establishing herself as a formidable presence in American theater beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period during which she consciously built a reputation distinct from her famous family name through sheer consistency of craft. Burton became particularly celebrated for her extensive work in theater, earning multiple nominations for major theatrical awards across a career defined by a commitment to serious dramatic material, including celebrated performances in classic and contemporary plays that established her among the most respected stage actresses of her generation. Alongside this theatrical career, she maintained a steady and respected presence in television and film, taking on supporting and recurring roles that allowed her to bring the same rigor and specificity she applied to her stage work into more mainstream visual media. Her involvement in Unfaithful reflected the kind of prestige supporting casting that directors like Adrian Lyne often sought, performers with substantial theatrical credibility who could bring immediate depth and credibility to smaller but important roles within a larger ensemble, lending scenes an added weight simply through the discipline and precision of her presence. Dominic Chianese, another key supporting presence in the film, had already built an extraordinarily distinguished career by the time of Unfaithful's production, spanning more than 4 decades of consistent, dedicated work across stage, film, and television by the time he took on his role in the film. Long before wider mainstream recognition arrived, Chianese had built a substantial reputation within the New York theater community, training and performing in serious dramatic and musical productions that established the foundation of technical skill he would carry into every subsequent role. His film career included a memorable supporting role in one of American cinema's most celebrated crime family sagas earlier in his career, a small but distinctive part in a landmark work of American filmmaking that introduced him to a much wider audience than his theater work alone had reached. It was, however, his long-running role in a landmark television crime drama that redefined the possibilities of serialized television storytelling that brought Chianese his most significant and sustained recognition, earning him widespread critical acclaim across the show's multi-year run and introducing an entirely new generation of viewers to a performer whose craft had been quietly maturing for decades before that role finally gave it the spotlight it deserved. His presence in Unfaithful, arriving during a period when his television work had brought him significant renewed visibility and critical attention, added further gravity to the film's supporting ensemble, reflecting director Adrian Lyne's consistent approach of surrounding his central performers with a supporting cast of considerable depth and experience. Actors whose mere presence in a scene communicated a seriousness of craft that elevated the material around them. Taken together, the ensemble assembled for Unfaithful reflected a careful, deliberate approach to casting, pairing two established leading performers in Richard Gere and Adrian Lyne, each bringing decades of accumulated craft and audience trust to roles that demanded enormous vulnerability. With an international discovery in Olivier Martinez, whose relative unfamiliarity to American audiences at the time only heightened the sense of Paul Martel as a genuinely disruptive, unpredictable presence, entering the Sumners' otherwise stable world. Director Adrian Lyne understood, in assembling this particular combination of performers, that the credibility of the entire story depended on an audience believing completely in the marriage being threatened, in the temptation disrupting it, and in the collateral damage rippling outward from both. And the casting choices reflected a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what each performer could bring to that delicate balance. The supporting performers, drawn from backgrounds spanning celebrated television drama, serious American theater, and prestige crime cinema, provided a foundation of craft and credibility around the central trio, allowing director Adrian Lyne to build a film that felt, in every corner of its cast, populated by performers capable of carrying real psychological weight. A quality that remains central to why Unfaithful continues to be remembered as one of the more effective and emotionally serious entries in the genre of the modern American thriller. Even performers appearing in only a handful of scenes brought with them decades of accumulated craft, ensuring that the world surrounding the Sumners felt lived in and specific rather than merely functional, populated by detectives, neighbors, and colleagues who each seemed to carry a fully imagined life beyond the frame of the story being told. Looking back at the film more than 2 decades after its release, what stands out most about its cast is the sheer density of talent assembled around a relatively contained, character-driven story, the kind of ensemble that studios of that era were still willing to build around serious adult drama rather than reserving such resources exclusively for larger commercial spectacles. Richard Gere and Adrian Lyne, each already established stars with decades of prior success behind them, took on a project that offered no guarantee of easy audience sympathy, playing characters whose choices ranged from understandable to genuinely disturbing, and the willingness of 2 performers at that stage of their careers to embrace such morally complicated material speaks to the seriousness with which they approached their craft. Olivier Martinez, arriving from an entirely different national film industry, brought an outsider's freshness to a role that could easily have felt like a familiar genre archetype in less capable hands. And the supporting players, veterans of stage, screen, and prestige television alike, rounded out a cast whose collective experience gave Unfaithful a texture and gravity that helped elevate it beyond the more sensationalized erotic thrillers that had proliferated in the years before its release, cementing its reputation as a genuinely serious, psychologically rich piece of American filmmaking anchored by performers fully committed to the difficult truths at its center. If you enjoyed learning about the lives and careers behind Unfaithful, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves discovering the real stories behind their favorite films, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed cast breakdowns like this one. Unfaithful, the budget, the production, and the lighter moments behind the camera. Before diving in, it is worth being upfront about something. Documented, verifiable stories of genuine comedy unfolding on the set of Unfaithful are not something the public record offers in great abundance. This was, after all, an intensely serious psychological drama, shepherded by a director known for demanding emotional truth above almost everything else, and the interviews, documentaries, and press coverage surrounding the film focus overwhelmingly on the weight of the material rather than any light-hearted chaos behind the camera. What follows, then, is not an invented catalogue of gags and pranks dressed up as fact. It is instead a thorough, honest look at how the film was actually financed, built, and shot, along with the genuine moments of levity, warmth, and human unpredictability that did surface in the accounts the cast and crew have given over the years, presented exactly as they were described rather than exaggerated for effect. The money behind the movie. Unfaithful was produced on a budget of approximately $50 million, a substantial figure for what was, at its core, an intimate three-hander built around a marriage, an affair, and the devastating consequences that followed. That number placed the film comfortably in the mid-range of studio productions for its era, larger than a true independent drama but far smaller than the effects-driven blockbusters that dominated the same summer release calendar. It is worth pausing on that figure for a moment, because it says something meaningful about how the studio system of the early 2000s still valued a certain category of adult, star-driven drama, willing to commit substantial resources to a film with no explosions, no elaborate stunt sequences, and no franchise potential. Simply because the combination of a respected director and two established leading performers was considered a sound enough commercial bet to justify the investment. The budget reflected several realities of the production. This was not a film that could be shot cheaply on a soundstage with minimal production value, because so much of its emotional power depended on the specificity of its locations, the believable wealth and comfort of the Sumner household, the density and texture of New York City streets, and the carefully art-directed interior of Paul Martel's apartment, filled with rare books and warm, deliberately chosen furnishings that needed to feel authentic rather than generic. Location shooting of this scale and duration, particularly in a market as expensive as New York City and its surrounding suburbs, carries substantial costs beyond simply securing permits, including the logistics of closing streets, managing local residents and businesses during filming, and transporting a full production crew and its equipment between multiple distinct filming environments across the length of the shoot. The film was financed and produced through a combination of major industry players, with Fox 2000 Pictures and Regency Enterprises serving as the primary production companies behind the project, and 20th Century Fox handling worldwide theatrical distribution. This kind of studio-backed structure gave the production access to significant resources, experienced department heads, and the kind of marketing muscle that allowed Unfaithful to compete for audience attention even in a summer season crowded with much larger commercial releases. Arnon Milchan, whose Regency Enterprises banner had built a reputation for backing ambitious, star-driven dramas throughout the 1990s, served as one of the key executive producers on the project, alongside Pierre Richard Muller and Lawrence Stephen Myers, while Adrian Lyne himself took on producing duties alongside G. Mac Brown, giving the director an unusually direct hand in the financial and logistical shape of the production, not simply its creative direction. Additional production involvement came through Epsilon Motion Pictures and a German associated production entity, reflecting the kind of international co-financing arrangements that had become increasingly common for mid-budget studio dramas of this era, spreading financial risk across multiple partners while also potentially easing the film's path into international markets. Given its $50 million budget, the film needed to perform respectably at the box office to be considered a financial success, and it ultimately did so comfortably. Unfaithful opened in North America in May of 2002, debuting to an opening weekend gross of just over $14 million, a strong result considering it was competing directly against the cultural phenomenon of a major superhero blockbuster dominating theaters that same month. A film so overwhelming at the box office that it effectively reset industry expectations for what an opening weekend could look like. Placing second at the box office behind that kind of cultural juggernaut, while still delivering a respectable opening for an adult drama, spoke to the genuine audience appetite that still existed for this kind of star-driven, morally complex material even during a season increasingly dominated by spectacle-driven filmmaking. Over its full domestic theatrical run, the film went on to earn a little more than $52 million within the United States and Canada alone, essentially recovering its production budget from domestic box office receipts before any international revenue was even factored in. This kind of theatrical longevity, sustaining strong weekly grosses well beyond its opening weekend rather than dropping off sharply, reflected the positive word of mouth building around Adrian Lyne's performance in particular, with industry trackers noting a multiplier effect suggesting audiences were actively recommending the film to others rather than simply attending based on advertising alone. When international markets were added to the total, Unfaithful's worldwide box office climbed to approximately $119 million, more than double its original production budget, with particularly strong results in European markets including Germany and the United Kingdom. A result that made it a clear financial success for the studio and reinforced the continued commercial viability of adult-oriented psychological dramas built around star power rather than spectacle. This box office performance carried particular significance within the broader arc of Adrian Lyne's career. Unfaithful arrived several years after his previous film, a controversial adaptation of a classic literary work that had generated considerable public debate, and the commercial and critical success of Unfaithful represented something of a validation for Lyne, proof that his particular sensibility, patient, sensuous, unafraid of moral complexity, could still connect with mainstream audiences at scale. The gap between that earlier, more divisive project and Unfaithful had given Lyne time to select his next project carefully, and the eventual success of Unfaithful suggested that patience had paid off, delivering both the strongest critical reception and one of the stronger box office results of his career at that point. It would, as it turned out, also be his final theatrical directorial credit for 2 full decades, a fact that in hindsight gives the film's substantial box office performance an added layer of significance as the capstone of that phase of his career, a high note on which to close out an extended chapter of his filmmaking before an unusually long gap preceded his eventual return to feature directing years later. Bringing the story to the screen. The origins of Unfaithful trace back not to an entirely original screenplay but to a much older piece of cinema, a 1969 French film centered on a wife's affair and the devastating consequences that follow her husband's discovery of it, directed by the celebrated French filmmaker whose work was known for its cool, clinical examination of bourgeois hypocrisy and moral collapse. Adapting that material for a contemporary American studio audience required significant reshaping, since the original film's more restrained, observational European sensibility needed to be translated into a register that would resonate with mainstream American audiences accustomed to more overt emotional expression and a faster narrative pace. The task fell to screenwriters Alvin Sargent and William Broyles Jr., 2 accomplished writers whose combined body of work spanned decades of respected American filmmaking. Sargent, a veteran screenwriter with a long history of adapting complex emotional material for the screen and a track record that included some of the more acclaimed literary and dramatic adaptations of previous decades, brought a particular sensitivity to character interiority, while Broyles, known for tackling stories rooted in moral ambiguity and difficult ethical terrain, contributed a structural rigor that helped shape the film's escalating tension from quiet suburban stability toward its violent, unresolved climax. Adrian Lyne's involvement in the project was, by all accounts, central to the eventual shape and tone of the film. Lyne had spent decades building a body of work fascinated by the mechanics of desire and its consequences, and Unfaithful gave him an opportunity to revisit that territory with a maturity and psychological depth that some critics felt distinguished it from his flashier, more overtly erotic earlier work. Lyne was known throughout his career for an exacting, detail-obsessed approach to filmmaking, a director who would work closely with actors to strip away performance artifice in pursuit of something that felt lived rather than acted, and this reputation shaped much of how the production of Unfaithful was structured, with substantial rehearsal time built in before cameras ever rolled, allowing Gere, Lyne, and Martinez the space to develop the texture of their characters' relationships before facing the demands of the shooting schedule itself. This rehearsal-heavy approach was consistent with methods Lyne had employed across his earlier films, reflecting a directorial philosophy that treated the weeks before principal photography as every bit as important to the final performance as the actual days spent in front of the camera. Casting the film required finding performers capable of carrying an enormous amount of interior, often worthless emotional weight, and the casting team, led by Billy Hopkins alongside Suzanne Smith, Carrie Barden, and Mark Bennett, worked to assemble a trio of leads whose chemistry and individual craft could sustain a story built almost entirely around silence, suspicion, and restrained devastation rather than dialogue-heavy confrontation. This casting team had a substantial track record of assembling ensembles for serious dramatic material across American independent and studio filmmaking, and their involvement on Unfaithful reflected the production's clear priority on finding performers who could deliver the specific, controlled emotional realism the material demanded rather than simply filling roles with recognizable names. Richard Gere's casting as Edward brought immediate star power and decades of experience playing controlled, internally conflicted men, while Diane Lane's casting as Connie represented, as it turned out, one of the most significant and successful casting decisions of the production, an actress whose career had been building steadily toward exactly this kind of demanding, emotionally exposed role for years. Olivier Martinez, considerably less familiar to American audiences at the time, was cast as Paul Martel in a decision that ultimately worked in the film's favor, his relative unfamiliarity lending the character an appropriately disruptive, unpredictable quality within the otherwise recognizable world of two established American stars. This casting logic, pairing two established American names with a genuine international discovery for the pivotal third role, mirrored a strategy Lyne and his casting team appeared to understand intuitively. That audience familiarity with Gere and Lyne would ground the film's central marriage in immediate credibility, while an unfamiliar face as Paul would preserve the sense of him as a genuine outside disruption entering that established world, exactly the dynamic the story itself required to function. Where the cameras rolled. Much of the film's emotional authenticity depended on its locations, and the production made the deliberate choice to shoot extensively on location throughout New York City and its surrounding suburban communities rather than relying heavily on soundstage work. The Sumner family home, the anchor of the entire story and the visual symbol of the stable, comfortable life at stake in Connie's affair, was filmed at an actual historic farmhouse-style colonial residence in Westchester County, a large property with white siding and green shutters dating back to the early 19th century, chosen specifically for the way its classic, established elegance could communicate generations of accumulated stability without a single line of dialogue. Production designer Brian Morris and his team worked to dress the interior of the house in a way that felt genuinely inhabited rather than staged, filling it with the accumulated clutter of a real family life, school papers, half-finished projects, the visual evidence of an ordinary domestic routine that made its eventual disruption feel all the more devastating by contrast. Securing a private residence of this scale for an extended film shoot represents its own significant production challenge, requiring negotiations with homeowners willing to temporarily hand over their property to a full film crew, along with the logistics of protecting the house and grounds from the wear and tear that inevitably comes with weeks of trucks, cabling, lighting rigs, and dozens of crew members moving through and around a private home. Local news coverage from Westchester County at the time of filming noted the presence of the production in the area, with residents observing the unusual sight of a major studio shoot unfolding in their otherwise quiet suburban community, complete with production vehicles, catering tents, and the general infrastructure that accompanies a film crew of this size settling into a residential neighborhood for an extended period. The scenes set in Manhattan, by contrast, needed to communicate an entirely different energy, the chaotic, anonymous freedom of a city where Connie could become someone other than a wife and mother, if only for a few stolen hours at a time. The production shot extensively on actual New York City streets, capturing the specific texture of the city's wind-funneled avenues and crowded sidewalks that set the entire plot in motion during the film's opening act. Shooting on functioning New York City streets required the kind of extensive municipal coordination that has become a defining feature of location-heavy productions in the city, including permits from the city's film office, coordination with local police for traffic and pedestrian management, and the scheduling flexibility to work around the unpredictable realities of shooting in a genuinely active urban environment rather than a controlled backlit standing in for New York. Paul Martel's apartment, filled with rare books and warm, worn furnishings that needed to feel like the product of years of careful collecting rather than a set decorator's quick assembly, was built with particular attention to detail, giving the space a lived-in intimacy that helped sell the believability of Connie's attraction to both the man and the alternate life his apartment seemed to represent. The production's art department reportedly sourced genuine antiquarian books and period furnishings to fill the space, a level of detail that might easily escape a casual viewer's notice but that contributed meaningfully to the overall sense of a character whose interior life felt fully formed rather than sketched in for the convenience of the plot. Cinematographer Peter Bijou, an accomplished director of photography with decades of acclaimed work behind him, brought a visual sensibility to the film that moved fluidly between the cool, controlled compositions of the Sumner's suburban life and the warmer, more intimate, sometimes fragmented visual language used to capture Connie's time with Paul. A stylistic contrast that reinforced the film's central tension without requiring a single word of explanatory dialogue. Editor N.V. Coates, a legendary figure in film editing with a career stretching back decades and credits including some of the most acclaimed films in cinema history, brought her considerable expertise to shaping the film's rhythm, particularly in its fragmented, memory-like editing of the affair's early stages. A stylistic choice that helped communicate Connie's psychological state without resorting to explanatory narration. The physical demands of the production. The making of Unfaithful required considerable physical commitment from its lead actors, and Adrian Lyne in particular has spoken candidly in interviews given years after the film's release about just how demanding certain sequences proved to be. The film's pivotal early intimate encounter between Connie and Paul, which appears in fragmented flashback as Connie rides a Metro-North train home in emotional turmoil, required an extraordinary number of takes to capture correctly, with Lyne recalling in a later interview that the sequence required somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 separate takes to get right. She described the physical reality of the scene candidly, explaining that her co-star was fully committed to the physicality the moment required, supporting his weight against her while the camera needed a clear line of sight to her face and reactions throughout, a combination of demands that meant repeating the same complicated physical positioning again and again until the take satisfied everyone involved. The physical demands of repeatedly performing the same complex, emotionally exposed choreography across so many takes eventually took a toll, and Lyne has described suffering a neck injury during filming, a strain significant enough that she did not fully register its severity until the following day,